bit about the famine and the genocide in Ireland, when it was, what it was. I know you have a document or a map here.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that many of the Irish in Chicago, in this part of the States, came over here during that time, and they're descendants of people who came over in those terrible years. They're survivors of a genocide. There were 3 genocides in Ireland. There was one under Elizabeth I, in which half the population was wiped out.
And that was the illegitimate daughter of Henry VIII?
Correct. A second one under Cromwell, to hell or Connacht, and then the one of 1845, 1850.
Oliver Cromwell, the Calvinist who took over?
Correct. Yes. The so-called Republican. By the way, when Mary and I say Republican, we really mean that with a small r.
Right. Not Democrat, not Republican.
That's right. But and then the last one was the so-called potato famine. But some years ago, 1983, while in the course of doing my grandfather's biography, who I'm sad to say was in the British Army, in the Public Record Office of the British government, of the British state, in Kew Gardens, London, their National Archives, I found out that the regiment that he served in, when he was 7, 8, 9, and 10 years of age in County Tipperary, it was starving South County Galway. Had been sent in to Ireland, to South County Galway, to remove all the food from South County Galway to the port of Galway for export. There was an abundant foods of all kinds in Ireland, and it was.
Now, when you say types of wheat,
oats, barley, rye, poultry, beef, mutton, the whole range, vegetable, everything. It was abundant in its food. So I found out that...
So there was no shortage of food from natural disaster,
correct.
Some kind of lack of rainfall, or economic conditions even?
One of 15 crops failed. The potato crop failed. It failed throughout Europe, but there was no famine anywhere. But when Britain sent in 75 regiments to...
And now why did they send in 75 regiments?
Because their potato crop failed, and the English people were heavily dependent. The London Times of August 25th, 1845 said that the average Englishman's day consisted of two meals of potatoes. So they were heavily dependent upon potatoes.
So potato was a staple in the diet of both the Anglo-British as well as the Irish, Celtic, or whatever other people would be.
But the British or English were living in urban areas, mostly in cities, so they survived by food that was brought in from elsewhere. While in Ireland, they lived on land, and there was abundant food of all kinds. So to say that the potato crop failed, therefore the people died, would be like saying in Chicago, pizza disappeared, so we all starved to death. It just doesn't make any sense. So in the course of my investigation...
So even if the potato crop failed, people may not have been happy or the same choice or their stock, but there would have been other things for sustenance.
And there was. And 200,000 British soldiers removed all that other food. And this is where I think we'll bring up...
Now, you're making a claim that, as we've discussed, though, is not necessarily the claim of the so-called mainstream historians. Is that correct?
No, in fact, many are denying this, while others are embracing it.
So they can't deny it and prove that it's not correct. It's there. The information is still available in Kew Gardens. At the time when Chris picked it up, it is still there. And those who want to find it, if they want to find it.
So you have historical evidence of documented archival evidence
Absolutely.
of both proof of a British famine from London newspapers.
No, it was a fear of a British famine.
Okay, fear of a famine, as well as the deployment of, which would have been in military records, of these 75 regiments.
Correct.
Now, forgive my lack of knowledge of how many people would be in a regiment.
Typically about 1,000, 800 to 1,000. Varies an awful lot. In the American Army, there are 200 in a company, and there are 4 or 5 companies, 4 companies plus a headquarters company in a regiment. So it's approximately 1,000. But in this case, there were 200,000, including the constabulary. And by the way, that was 200,000, but about 100,000 at any given moment. About 100,000 at any given moment. And every flag here is a location of a British regiment. And while this is a snapshot of what happened, they typically remained in one location for one tour, a year and a half or so. And so there was some to and fro between here and the colonies and here in England, and also some shuffling around within the country. All of these regiments were here. There are 75 regiments.
Now, just for the sake of our view on the audience and a little we're discussing genocide, so we don't be too nostalgic. What part of Ireland is your family from?
Yes, I was raised in Castlereagh, right there, and there are 3 mass graves around our town from those years. Mary was born and raised right in the middle of County Limerick, Croom, right there, and there's a mass grave where she comes from.
Okay.
But it turns out that at the time we made this map, we had discovered something like 180 mass graves. But after Mary and I put up a memorial at one that was brought to our attention in North County Galway, near Ballymoe, so many people came to us with knowledge of other mass graves that had been in their family, that they had known about ever since 1845, 1850, that we've concluded that there are some 3,000 or so mass graves in Ireland perpetrated, filled with people murdered in those years. But if anyone would say whose people are from County Cork, the British regiment who starved County Cork, 12th Lancers, they were horseback, the 61st Regiment of Foot, the 3rd Regiment of Foot, the 3rd Hussars, and the 16th Regiment of Foot. In Kerry there were only 2 regiments, the 8th Dragoons on horseback and the 1st Dragoons on horseback. The reason why they'd be on horseback there is that it's very rough land in West Kerry, and they'd be probably only moving sheep off the mountains into the ships for export, and that'd be done by horseback. In the areas where there are no regiments, in County Sligo and up along the top, that indicates either the land is very poor and there's not much crops here in West Mayo, also Northwest Mayo, or that there were so many local Protestants that they didn't have to use the army to move the food out, because Protestants, as the British in Ireland, were not targeted for extermination. The Irish were, and they were identified as Catholic, and there's plenty of evidence as to what the intentions were. They were doing 2 things. They were sending food over to England out of here, but they were also wiping out the Irish. And they wiped out half the Catholic population in 5.5 years. In fact, more...
Now, is that wiping out by death and immigration, or just death?
Murder, by death.
Okay.
Another million escaped successfully. In fact, in a paper I made...
And this would be right before our Civil War, so...
Correct.
This would be the immigration that was coming through New York, then to other Boston, Chicago.
That's correct.
Right before the Civil War.
And you should see how the Chicago Tribune reported on these people at the time. It's hard to believe.
And the New York Times,
I suppose. But in the Chicago Tribune, the women were drunken prostitutes and the men were drunken drunks. But that's the way, or drunken criminals of some kind. It's really sad. So, in fact, in a newspaper, I'm leaving here, Saoirse, the current edition of a newspaper from Ireland, a man was arrested recently for public begging, and he was in violation of a law that was enacted in 1845, when the people of Ireland took to the roads and just wandered into oblivion, to death mostly, and anyone caught begging was summarily dispatched or gotten rid of. So in Mary's...
Point us now where the 6 counties are: Northern Ireland, the occupied territory.
Yeah, that's right around here. This area here. It does not include the northernmost part, which is County Donegal. It's actually the northeastern part.
6 counties around Lough Neagh and County Fermanagh.
That's it. And by the way, on this map, anyone who goes to the website can look it up under irishholocaust.org. And if they
irishholocaust.org.
Yes,
because on the screen we still have terrorismireland.org, which is a good website.
Yeah.
But irishholocaust.org.
Correct. And the capitalized letters are counties, and the lowercase are towns, location of mass graves that we had discovered at the time we made this. This is a copyrighted map and a copyrighted piece of work.
And the little cross here is a mass grave, every one of them.
Yeah, every cross is a mass grave, but we only knew about 180 at the time we made this. Now we've learned that there are thousands, probably about 3,000, we believe. So if anyone from County Mayo can know that their people were starved by the 19th Hussars, the 7th Hussars, the 5th Dragoons, and the 30th Regiment of Foot, and the 69th Regiment of Foot. People from Clare were starved by the 7th Regiment of Foot, the 41st Regiment of Foot, and the 73rd Regiment of Foot.
Now, as a side note, we want to keep the map up for a little bit. Hundreds of years have already passed where Irish could not hold property, or Irish Catholics could not hold property, where there was forced immigration of British, non-Celtic, or maybe they were Celtic, but Norman, Saxons, peoples by land, and then forced conversions, or also conversion by incentive to Protestantism. So most of the people could not even own land.
Correct. Of the Catholic population, well, first of all, when the Normans came in a generation or two, they had become completely Irish. But it was after Elizabeth I and subsequent to that that they remained distinctly apart, and they practiced in Ireland what they later used against the original Americans. They developed
the American Indians, the
yes.
indigenous people.
Right. So they practiced it here, and they found out what worked and didn't work. They didn't completely wipe out the Irish, so they used even more stringent methods here. But the removal of the food was their main move, and their opinion molders, those who do their columns and those who write for them at the time, 150 years ago, are quite clear as to what the nation was about. This was an attempt to replace the Irish people with English people. 95% of the product of the land, 95% of the land was said to be owned by English people. They claimed it, even though they never bought it. They said it was theirs, and therefore the produce of all work done on that land was claimed by those who claimed ownership of it. And that was the legal rationale for removing all the food. The food did not belong in their minds to the people who grew it. It belonged to whoever said he owned the land. And when in County Offaly here, when they started to develop a system of poorhouses, they decided they would have to make the local landlords pay for it. They found out that there were only 8 men owned all the land of County Offaly, and all 8 were Englishmen living in England. And it was the same throughout the country. The owners, the so-called owners of all this land, were almost all Englishmen living in England at the time. The English press referred to them as Irish landlords, but that was just a way of escaping, you see, escaping.
Now, one other form of cultural genocide maybe you could discuss is that the original language of the Irish is not English, as most people assume or think.
Yes.
It's Gaelic.
Yes.
And that Gaelic was also outlawed. So the language of the indigenous original language was outlawed.
It was wiped out. In fact, by the time of the starvation of Ireland, the language was no longer a crime to speak the language, but they're the ones who died. That half of the population was the Gaelic-speaking population. And by the way, 5.25 million people died. And that's a greater number of Irish who died in 5.5 years than were Jews murdered by the Nazis some 90 years later, according to Jewish historians, those who have credible backgrounds, who claim there was 5.1 million. In fact, that's the highest of 2 figures that is generally accepted. So it's been an unbelievable history. So this is now being used in City College of Chicago, because a couple of professors have contacted me and have asked to use it. And it's being used in a number of universities across the country. Can you think, Mary? Seton Hall in Down East. I shouldn't have started talking about it because my mind's gone blank. But a bunch of high schools, Holy Cross here in Chicago, and quite a few others, are using this to teach Irish.
Now, as this is a very quick side note, there is a resurgence, though, of Gaelic speaking, even though English is the official language.
Yes.
Is that a number of people have learned Gaelic, are learning Gaelic, young people speak Gaelic.
And parents are speaking in their houses for their children. So that the Gaeltacht, the Gaelic-speaking part of Ireland, West Donegal, West Mayo and West Galway, West Kerry, and a little spot here in Waterford, used to be called the Gaeltacht. And the English has crept in there now also, but now well-educated people in Dublin and the cities are using Gaelic in their homes. I hope it continues.